My son called on a Tuesday, not our usual day. At the end of the call, he used a phrase we had created when he was 17. We hadn't used it in 31 years. He said, "Dad, did you check the mail today?" I was at the kitchen counter refilling the bird feeder tray when the phone buzzed and skittered an inch before I caught it. I saw his name and felt that small automatic jump in my chest that never quite goes away. Sundays were our day. 4 o'clock, after his girls were down for naps, 20 minutes or 40 depending on the week, and then nothing until the next Sunday unless something was wrong. It was Tuesday, 11 in the morning. "Hey Dad, you got a minute?" His voice was careful, not shaking, not urgent, careful, the way a man's voice gets when he's decided in advance exactly how much to let show. I've known that voice 48 years. I know the difference between him being calm and him working at sounding calm. This was the second one. "I've got more than a minute," I said. "What's going on?" "Nothing urgent, just wanted to check in." So we talked, easy and unhurried. He asked about my back, about the tire pulling on my truck, about my neighbor across the street who'd just had her knee done. Ordinary things, the kind of small specific questions that tell you someone's been thinking about you between calls, not just performing concern. We talked almost 15 minutes like that, and I remember thinking, right in the middle of it, that nothing unusual was happening at all, that maybe he'd caught a slow morning at work and didn't know what else to do with it. Then, right before he said he had to get back to it, he asked about the mail. "Hey Dad, did you check the mail today?" I want to tell you my first reaction was confusion. It wasn't. Every hair on my arms stood up because I knew exactly what those words meant the instant they left his mouth, even though it had been 31 years since anyone had said them to me, even though I hadn't consciously thought about that phrase in probably 15. You have to understand where it came from, because nothing that happened later makes sense without it. I raised him alone for most of his growing up. His mother and I split when he was 10, and after that it was just the two of us in a house that always felt a size too big for two people. I wasn't the father who sat him down for long emotional talks. I was the father who showed up. I drove him places. I fixed what broke, but I worried, the way you worry when you're doing it alone, with nobody lying next to you at night to say out loud what you're both already thinking. Underneath the ordinary worries, grades, friends, the girl who broke his heart freshman year, there was the one that doesn't get talked about enough, that someday he'd be somewhere he shouldn't be, in a situation gone sideways the particular way teenage situations go sideways, without a way to ask for help that didn't make him look weak in front of whoever was standing next to him. Kids that age would rather ride home from a bad night than admit out loud they're in one. I knew that because I'd been that age myself, a long time before cell phones existed to make any of it easier. So when he was 17, I gave him a way out that didn't cost him anything. It was a Saturday in March, the spring of his junior year. We'd driven to the hardware store for deck screws and wood filler, one of those errands that eats an afternoon once you count the drive and the standing around comparing prices you don't really care about. He was quiet on the way back, looking out the window at nothing, and I remember thinking he had that look kids get when something's chewing on them they haven't decided whether to bring up. I didn't push. Pushing never worked with him. He talked when he was ready and not a minute before. So I let the radio fill the silence for a while, and then, somewhere past the second stoplight, I just said it. "I want to show you something." He looked over at me like I'd said something strange. "Show me what?" "Not show you, tell you. I want to give you something, and I want you to actually use it if you ever need it, instead of being too proud." He waited. "If you're ever somewhere," I said, "and something feels wrong, I don't care what it is, doesn't matter if it turns out to be nothing, and you need me to come get you, I want you to call me and say, 'Dad, did you check the mail today?' That's it. Just that. Nothing else." "The mail," he repeated, like he was checking the words for a joke he'd missed. "It's ordinary," I said. "Nobody standing next to you will think twice about it, but I'll know, and the second I hear it, I'm coming to get you. No questions when I get there. No lecture the next morning. I'm just going to come." He was quiet for a while, the particular quiet that comes over a teenager when something lands differently than they expected. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, careful not to spook whatever was happening behind his face. Finally, he said, "Okay, you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yeah, Dad, I understand." We never spoke of it again after that day. Not once, not even in passing. I dropped him off, put the deck screws away, and went back to being the ordinary version of a father I was most days. But I carried that conversation differently than most of the ones we'd had. I thought about it sometimes late at night, wondering if I'd done something useful or just embarrassed him in a car he couldn't escape from for another 15 minutes. He used it twice that first year of college, both times over the phone, both about situations that turned out smaller than they'd felt to him in the moment. I never asked for details he didn't offer. I just drove the 4 hours when he called, arriving after midnight, and we spent the ride home mostly in comfortable silence, him asleep against the window before we'd even hit the highway. He used it once more his senior year, for something he still hasn't told me the specifics of, and I've never asked. Some things are his to keep, and then, the way most things make sense in hindsight and none at all while you're living through them, he simply stopped needing it. He graduated. He got a job 3 hours from where he'd grown up. He met the woman who'd become his wife at a mutual friend's barbecue, and I remember him calling to tell me about her with an unguarded excitement I hadn't heard in his voice since he was small enough to believe I could fix anything. They married in a backyard with string lights and a borrowed sound system. They had 2 girls, 4 years apart, both of whom call me by a nickname I never chose and wouldn't trade for anything. Sunday calls became our thing somewhere in there. 4 o'clock, like clockwork, until it was just a fact of the week the way trash pickup is a fact of the week. I stopped thinking about the mail phrase entirely. It had done its job and aged aged out, the way most safety nets do once the person they were built for no longer needs the particular kind of catching they were designed for. 31 years. That's how long it sat unused, folded up somewhere in the part of memory where you keep things you don't expect to need again. Until that Tuesday, standing at my kitchen counter with a bag of birdseed in one hand when my son used it on me instead. "No, I haven't gotten to it yet," I told him, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "I'll go check in a bit." "Okay." No rush. A pause, half a second too long to be nothing. "Talk soon, Dad. Love you." "Love you too, son." We hung up, and I stood there holding a dead phone and a bag of birdseed, and for a moment I couldn't remember what I'd been doing before it rang. I should tell you a little about the life that phone call landed in the middle of, because none of what came next makes sense without it either. I live alone. Have for about 6 years now, since my second wife passed. Cancer, the fast kind. 11 weeks between the diagnosis and the funeral. My first marriage, my son's mother, ended the ordinary, unspectacular way most marriages end. My second was different, quieter. The kind of love that doesn't announce itself so much as sit there beside you every evening, dependable as furniture, until one day it isn't there, and the house feels like it's missing a load-bearing wall. I don't say that looking for sympathy. I say it because it matters to what happened next. A man alone at 63 isn't the same as a man alone at 30. The house is paid off, which sounds like a blessing and mostly is, except it also means nobody has any particular reason to call you about anything. The pension arrives the first of every month like clockwork, more than enough to live on and not quite enough to feel rich. There's the walk every morning before the neighborhood gets loud, church most Sundays, a volunteer shift at the food bank every Thursday sorting canned goods with a rotating cast of retirees who've become something like friends without any of us ever quite calling it that. I am not one of those men who sits in a recliner and waits for the day to end. I stay busy, or I try to. But there's a particular quiet that settles into a house built for 2 people once it's down to 1, and no amount of Thursday morning sorting fully drowns it out. You notice it most in the hour after dinner, when there used to be a second person to talk to about the day. And now there's just the television and the sound of your own fork against your own plate. I'm telling you this not as an excuse, but as an explanation. Because when a man moved in 2 houses down the following spring, friendly and easy to talk to, the kind who paid attention and remembered small details you hadn't expected him to keep, it didn't register as anything to be cautious about. It registered as something closer to relief. That Tuesday call is where I started this story, but it happened almost a year into everything else in it. The story, it was actually about started the previous April, on an ordinary Saturday morning when I was up on a ladder cleaning gutters clogged with a winter's worth of oak leaves, cursing under my breath, and a voice from the yard below said something friendly enough that I looked down to see who it belonged to. I want you to understand, before I go any further, that nothing about those months felt wrong while they were happening. Not one moment. If there'd been some obvious tell, I'd tell you about it and let you feel superior to my not noticing. There wasn't. It felt, from the very first conversation, like exactly what it was designed to feel like. It felt like making a friend. You want a hand with that? Or is cursing at it part of the process? I looked down from the ladder to find a man standing at the edge of my yard, hands in his pockets, squinting up with the kind of easy grin that makes you grin back before you've decided to. Trim build, maybe 60. Hard to say exactly. A moving truck sat 2 houses down, back doors open, boxes visible inside. Cursing's mostly for my own benefit, I called down. Keeps the leaves motivated. He laughed genuinely. Just moved in. Company relocated me. Figured I'd introduce myself before you decided I was the neighborhood mystery man. I climbed down. We shook hands, and he told me his company had shifted him out from a few states away, that he didn't know a soul in the area yet, that the house needed more work than the listing photos let on. I told him about the gutters, about the oak tree that dropped leaves like it was getting paid by the pound. It was the kind of fence conversation that happens 100 times a year in every neighborhood and means nothing beyond itself, except this one kept going. He asked good questions. He remembered the answers. 2 weeks later, sanding a stretch of trim on his porch, he asked how the gutters had turned out. I hadn't mentioned I'd be finishing that same weekend. I told him they were done, and he nodded like he'd expected nothing less and asked if I wanted to come see what he'd done with the porch, and I did. One small errand of interest leading into the next. The way friendships used to form back when men my age still knew how to make them without a project or a woman doing the introducing. By June, we were sitting on his porch some evenings, watching the street go quiet as the light dropped. I helped him level a door frame that had been driving him crazy. He helped me haul a dead washing machine to the curb before I'd finished asking. Once, a Tuesday, he brought a casserole over unannounced, said he'd made too much for one person. It was good, chicken and rice, more seasoning than I'd have used myself. I told him so. He laughed and said his ex-wife used to say the same thing. I mentioned him to my son that summer, said there was a new neighbor 2 doors down, seemed like a decent guy. My son said that was nice, good to have someone close by you could actually talk to, and we moved on, because there was nothing about it worth lingering on. It was just good news. A quiet, ordinary piece of good news in a life that didn't get a lot of news most weeks. I want to be honest about what those porch evenings were worth to me, because it matters for everything after. At 63, alone, you don't make friends the way you did at 25, when your whole life was arranged around proximity to other people. Friendship Friendship at my age is scarcer, more accidental. You take what shows up, and what showed up that spring felt, in every ordinary way I knew how to measure it, like exactly the kind of thing a man in my situation should have been grateful for. It was in August, watching the streetlights come on down the block, that he first mentioned the platform, not a pitch, more like a man thinking out loud. A friend of his back home had gotten into some kind of investment platform, newer, smaller than the big names, doing well. I told him I didn't have the head for markets, never had. Neither did I, most of my life, he said, still watching the streetlights. But you get to a certain point, living on a fixed income, and you start paying attention. He didn't say more that night. I went home and didn't think about it again. It had been one sentence in an evening full of them. He brought it up again in September, this time with specifics. A tier system, small commitments yielding modest returns, larger ones yielding considerably more. Late in October, on his porch, he pulled out his phone without my asking and turned the screen toward me. "Look at this," he said. "I still can't quite believe it." The number was significant. I won't say it out loud even now. What I felt looking at it, and I'm not proud of this, was envy. The quiet, uncomfortable kind you're ashamed to admit to. "That's something," I said. "I know. I almost didn't do it." He put the phone away, looked out at the darkening street, and said the thing I've turned over in my mind more than almost anything else from that year. "You know, I worry about you out here alone. I hope you've got people looking out for you." I heard it as kindness. I heard it exactly the way he intended. The concern of a man who'd become, in 8 months, something close to a friend. In early November, I put money in, not my savings, an amount I told myself, and genuinely believed, I could afford to lose. He walked me through the account setup at his kitchen table one evening, my reading glasses pushed up on my forehead because I never remember to bring them where I need them. The number climbed almost immediately, fast enough that first week to feel a little extraordinary. I asked my son about it on a Sunday call, a few days after I'd put the money in. Said a neighbor had mentioned this platform. Kept my voice light, curious rather than committed. He looked it up while we talked. Wasn't finding much of anything, he said. No news coverage, no obvious red flags, but nothing to vouch for either. "Just be careful, Dad," he said. "If something sounds like a good deal, get a second opinion before you do anything big." "I'm not planning anything," I told him, which was true in that narrow moment. I told myself the same thing after we hung up. A small warning, filed away. A son doing his job. A father hearing him out. By the time the neighbor invited me over the following Tuesday evening to walk me through the next tier in person, I'd already decided in my own mind that the caution box was checked. I'd asked my son. I'd waited. Nothing alarming had turned up. It felt that week like the responsible version of the story rather than the reckless one. A man weighing a decision carefully instead of leaping at it. I went over. He had a fellow investor there already. A retired school teacher from 2 streets over I'd nodded to at the mailbox a few times but never properly met, who talked for a good 20 minutes about what the second tier had done for his daughter's wedding fund. It was, looking back, exactly the kind of ordinary, unremarkable social proof that convinces a careful man faster than any pitch could. I sat at that kitchen table, listened to the two of them talk numbers I only half followed, and by the end of the evening, I'd agreed to move a certificate of deposit I'd been letting sit untouched for 3 years into the second tier. I called my son the next morning to tell him. I remember feeling, dialing his number, something close to pride. "That's great, Dad," my son said when I gave him the news about the CD. "Just, you're sure about this? That's not nothing." "I've thought about it," I said. "You said be careful. I've been careful. I asked around. I watched it for weeks before I moved anything real. This isn't me being reckless." He didn't push back hard. I want to be fair to him here, because it would be easy for me to tell this story as though he'd missed something obvious, and he hadn't. What I described to him, a second opinion sought, a warning heeded, a decision made slowly rather than impulsively, was on its face exactly what a responsible man does. He had no way of knowing that every piece of that responsible-sounding story had been built for him to hear, that the whole shape of it had been anticipated and accounted for by someone better at this than either of us understood. The weeks after that felt, if anything, like a kind of vindication. The second tier performed the way the first had, maybe better. The neighbor and I settled into an easier rhythm on his porch, less about the platform now and more about ordinary things again. His daughter out west, my grandkids, a football season neither of our teams was having much luck with. I told myself when I thought about it at all that the hard part was behind me. I'd made a decision that felt big at the time. I'd done my diligence, and it was working out exactly the way it was supposed to. Looking back, I think that ease was the most dangerous part of the whole thing. Not the initial pitch, not even the money itself, but the several weeks of nothing happening. No red flags, no pressure, just a friendly man on a porch and a number on a screen that kept climbing. It let my guard, such as it had ever really been up, come all the way down. My son called less about it after that, which I took at the time as him being satisfied, and which I understand now as something closer to him quietly filing it away in the back of his mind, the way you file away a smell that isn't quite right in a house you otherwise trust. He mentioned once, in passing on a Sunday call in December, that he'd looked at the platform again out of curiosity, and still hadn't found much of anything about it either way. No glowing coverage, no warnings, just an absence, which he said felt a little strange for something with the kind of returns I'd described. I told him not everything makes the news. He agreed, and we moved on to talking about the girls' Christmas pageant, and I didn't think about the conversation again for weeks. I don't know exactly when he started actually digging into it in earnest rather than just noticing the strangeness in passing. He's never told me the precise moment, and I've never asked. The same way I never asked about that third time he used the male phrase in college. Some things are his to keep, even now. What I know is that by late January, something had shifted in him that I couldn't name yet and had no reason to look for. Our Sunday calls stayed the same length, covered the same ground, but there was, in retrospect, a slightly different quality to a few of his questions. An extra beat before he asked how the neighbor was doing. A little more specificity than usual when he asked whether I'd put in anything since the CD. I didn't notice it as anything at the time. You don't notice the change in air pressure before a storm unless you already know to be looking for it, and I had no reason yet to be looking. The neighbor, meanwhile, had started mentioning a third tier. Nothing pushy. That was never his style, and I understand now that the absence of pushiness was itself the technique, the patience of a man who knew that pressure applied too early spooks the kind of careful, responsible investor he'd spent 8 months building me into. He'd mention it the way he mentioned everything, almost offhand. A comment dropped into an evening about something else entirely. I hadn't said yes to anything yet. I also hadn't said no. It was the last Tuesday morning in January when the 11 o'clock call came in, my son's name lighting up the screen on a day that wasn't ours. He called back 4 minutes later, a different number. "Dad, don't hang up and don't react in a way anyone outside could see. Can you do that for me?" "Okay," I said, and I meant it, though my hand had already gone cold around the phone. "The neighbor, the one 2 doors down. I need you to tell me everything you know about him. His name, where he said he worked, anything he's ever told you about where he came from," I told him. It didn't take long, saying it out loud like that, stripped of the porch evenings and the casseroles and the easy conversation that had made all of it feel like something other than a list of unverifiable claims, a company relocation nobody could name, a daughter out west he never seemed to actually visit or be visited by, a house he was renting, not owning, though he'd let me believe otherwise without ever quite saying so directly. "He's a work-from-home consultant, Dad," my son said. "For nothing. There's no company. I've been looking into this since Sunday. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure yet, but I got sure this morning, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything back." He'd spent the better part of 2 days going deep on it, quietly, the way he does everything when he actually wants to understand something. My son's an engineer, methodical to a fault, the kind of man who reads the whole manual before he touches the machine. He'd found posts in fraud reporting forums, 3 of them, different usernames, describing a platform that matched what I'd described to him almost word for word. He'd found a filing with a Federal Consumer Protection Office, an open case number, no public details yet, but enough to confirm somebody official had already started looking. He'd found the pattern underneath the pattern, real gains shown early, small enough to feel true, engineered specifically to survive a cursory second opinion, then pressure toward larger and larger commitments before the account locked and the money became unreachable. And he'd found a man in Ohio. He read it to me over the phone, and I sat down at my kitchen table while he did, because I could feel in the first few sentences that I was going to need to be sitting down. A retired postal worker, 71 years old, living alone since his wife died 4 years earlier. A new neighbor that spring, friendly, easy to talk to, remembered what you told him the week before. Porch conversations that built slowly into a genuine feeling friendship over months. An investment platform mentioned almost offhand in August. A phone screen turned toward him in October showing a number that made him feel, in his own words, posted to a forum for people trying to piece together what had happened to them. Embarrassed to admit how much he'd wanted what that number represented. An invitation to come inside and meet another satisfied investor. Hear how it had helped pay for somebody's daughter's wedding. A larger commitment made not recklessly but carefully, deliberately, with a son's cautious blessing secured beforehand. And then, eventually, everything. "The neighbor asked me to come over again tonight," I said slowly, when he finished, "to talk about a third tier." "That's an escalation signal, Dad. They do it when they think the target's ready to move up." The timing lines up exactly with the Ohio case. A plateau where nothing happens for a few weeks to lower your guard, then a push right when you've stopped expecting one. Target. The word landed somewhere specific, somewhere underneath my ribs, and stayed there. I thought about the retired school teacher who'd been sitting at that kitchen table the night I moved the CD, talking easily about his daughter's wedding fund, a man I'd nodded to at the mailbox a dozen times over the years without ever learning much more about him than his face. I said his name to my son, or the little of it I actually knew. First name, general description, which street he'd said he lived on, and I heard my son go quiet on the other end of the line in a way that told me everything before he said a word. "I can't confirm that part yet, Dad, but I want you to think back. Has anyone ever actually seen that man at his house? Has anyone besides you at that specific table on that specific night?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't, not really, though I have my suspicions, and they aren't kind ones. That night, the sheriff's office took my statement over the phone and told me not to let anything about my behavior change, not to avoid the neighbor if I happened to see him, not to indicate in any way that something had shifted. My son drove 4 hours that same evening. No discussion about it, just a text that he was on the road and would be there by 9. He showed up with a bag of groceries because he said he figured I probably hadn't eaten properly, which was true, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table I realized partway through, where I'd agreed to move the CD, going through everything he'd found. We went through it piece by piece, and I recognized things I hadn't let myself recognize the first time around. The casserole that had appeared the same week the platform was first mentioned. Not before, not after. Timed with a precision I'd read as coincidence, because coincidence is so much easier to live inside than calculation. The phone turned toward me on the porch at exactly the moment the number would have looked most impressive against the darkening sky behind it. The line about worrying over me living alone, delivered the same week I'd have been most receptive to hearing it, right after I'd spent an evening admitting how quiet the house got some nights. I should have seen it, I said. These are professionals, Dad. This is what they do for a living. That's not a reflection on you. I'm not stupid. I know you're not. That's not the point. People like this specifically target people who aren't stupid, because those are the people who managed to save something worth stealing in the first place. You didn't stand a chance against that information. Arrange that carefully, by somebody who does nothing else all day but arrange it. I sat with that for a long while, the two of us at the table, the groceries he'd bought still sitting unopened on the counter because neither of us had thought about dinner in hours. The following morning, we drove to the sheriff's office together, my son carrying a folder of printed screenshots because he doesn't fully trust anything that only exists on a screen. The deputy who took the report was younger than I expected, maybe 30, but she knew immediately what she was looking at. Said the platform, or one close enough in structure to be the same operation under a different name, had already come up in 2 other counties in the state that year alone. She asked whether I had any money currently invested. I told her the full amount, the first tier and the CD both, and watched her write it down without any change in her expression, which I understood later was its own kind of professional kindness. Do not approach him, she said. Do not indicate anything has changed. If he contacts you again before we've had a chance to move, you call us first, before you answer. I told her I understood. My son sat beside me with his hand resting on the back of my chair the entire time, not saying much, just present in the specific way he'd been present as a boy whenever something had gone wrong that he didn't yet have the words to talk through. What nobody tells you about a situation like this is how long the waiting actually takes, and how strange it feels to keep living your ordinary life inside it. I went to church that Sunday, 4 days after the sheriff's office, and sat 2 pews from a family I'd known for years without hearing a word of the sermon, because I kept running the numbers in my head, how much was gone, how much might come back, whether I'd been foolish or just unlucky, and whether there was any real difference between the two once the money was actually missing. I went to the food bank that Thursday because not going would have drawn exactly the kind of attention the deputy had warned me against, and I stood there sorting canned green beans into cardboard flats with my hands shaking just slightly, hoping nobody I worked alongside noticed. The neighbor texted me twice that first week. Casual things, asking how I was, mentioning he'd missed me on the porch, wondering if I was still thinking about the 3rd tier. My son had made me promise to answer normally, to keep the rhythm exactly as it had always been. So I wrote back that I'd been under the weather, nothing serious, and that I was still turning the 3rd tier over in my mind. It was the hardest thing I did that whole week, typing out a friendly lie to a man I now understood had been lying to me for 8 straight months without a single visible seam. He knocked on my door on the 6th day. I saw him through the front window before I opened it, and for one long moment I stood in my own front hallway with my hand on the latch, running through everything my son and the deputy had told me, trying to make my face do what it needed to do. I opened the door. He stood there in a jacket I recognized, easy smile in place, and asked if I wanted to come over that evening. Said he had something he thought I'd want to see about the 3rd tier. I told him my back had been acting up, that I wasn't up to much of anything this week, and he said he understood completely, told me to feel better, and walked back down my front steps, whistling something I didn't recognize. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long time afterward, listening to my own pulse in my ears. I called the deputy that same afternoon and told her about the visit. She thanked me for reporting it immediately, said it matched information they were actively working with, and asked me gently to hold on just a little longer. 3 days after that, she called to tell me they had identified 2 more victims in our own county alone, both of whom had come forward once investigators started asking the right questions in the right places. A widow on the far side of town who'd lost a portion of her late husband's life insurance payout, and a retired mechanic who'd very nearly signed over a reverse mortgage before his daughter happened to visit and noticed the paperwork sitting on his kitchen table. The pattern matched almost exactly across all of us. New neighbor, months of patient, ordinary friendship, a number on a screen, a quiet mention of worry for someone living alone, and in at least one case, she told me, a second person present at a later meeting to vouch for the platform in person, someone the victim had assumed was simply a fellow investor, a neighbor, a retiree with a daughter's wedding to help pay for. I told her about the school teacher who'd sat at my kitchen table the night I moved the CD. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she asked me to describe him again, as precisely as I could, and I understood from the specific carefulness of her questions that I would probably never actually learn that man's real name, or whether school teacher had been any truer a word than consultant. The investigation moved fast after that. The man was not who he'd said he was, in almost every particular that could be checked. He had not been relocated by any company. There was no company. He had been renting the house 2 doors down for exactly 8 months, month to month, minimal furniture inside, the kind of arrangement built for a fast and forgettable exit. it. He had done something close to identical in 2 other towns in 3 years, under 2 other names, with 2 other sets of neighbors who had, in each case, been alone, recently widowed, and quietly starved for the specific kind of company he'd offered so generously. 11 days after that Tuesday call, they arrested him at a gas station 2 towns over, his bag already packed in the trunk of a car registered to neither of his known names. I won't say I felt good about the arrest exactly when the deputy called to tell me, "I don't think justice is ever as clean as you expect it to be while you're waiting for it." I thought about the retired postal worker in Ohio, whose name I still don't know, who'd lost most of what he had to the same patient, careful 8-month performance I'd sat through myself. I thought about the widow across town and the mechanic who'd nearly signed away his house, both of whom I'd never met and probably never will, bound to me now by something none of us would have chosen. I wondered, and still wonder, how many others there'd been in the 2 other towns, under the 2 other names, that nobody ever found or came forward to report. Most of my money came back over the following months. Not all of it, but most, recovered through the accounts the investigation traced before they could be fully emptied. The CD was harder. That money had moved further and faster, and a portion of it is likely gone for good. A fact I've made a slow, imperfect peace with in the way you make peace with weather you can't undo. My son handled most of the paperwork that followed, the affidavits, the correspondence with the recovery fund, the long phone calls with people whose job titles I could never quite remember afterward. He never once made me feel like a burden for needing the help, and he never once said the thing I kept waiting for him to say, the version of "I told you so that would have been fair for him to say, and that I would have understood if he had." The house 2 doors down sat empty for a while afterward, then sold to a young couple with 2 small boys and a dog that barks at every squirrel that crosses the yard. I've waved to them a few times over the fence. I haven't sat on that particular porch again, and I don't imagine I will. Months later, my son asked me, almost offhand, why I'd told him about the mail phrase in the first place, all those years ago in the truck. He said he'd been thinking about it lately, turning it over, trying to understand what had made me do it. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I think I just knew there'd come a day when you needed a way to tell me something you couldn't say out loud, and I wanted you to have it so you wouldn't have to be alone with it. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You knew it would work in both directions." I hadn't actually thought of it that way at the time, 31 years ago in a truck on the way home from a hardware store. But he was right. I'd made it for him. He'd used it on me. We'd built something together, without ever quite meaning to, that turned out to work both ways when it mattered most. I still take my walk every morning before the neighborhood gets loud. I still volunteer at the food bank on Thursdays, still sort canned goods with the same rotating cast of retirees, a couple of whom I've told the whole story to, in pieces, over time. I still go to church most Sundays. The quiet in the house after dinner hasn't gone anywhere. I don't think it ever fully does once you've lived inside it long enough, but it doesn't scare me the way it did that spring, back before I understood what a friendly stranger with good questions and a lot of patience could actually cost a man in my position. He called me the following Sunday, right on schedule, 4 o'clock, and we talked about the girls, about work, about a football game neither of our teams had managed to win. Ordinary things, the way it had always been before any of this started. At the end, before he said goodbye, he said, "Hey Dad, you should check your mail today. There might be something good in it." I knew there wasn't. I knew exactly what he was doing, using the old phrase now to say something entirely different than what it had ever meant before, turning 31 years of emergency into something gentler, something closer to a joke only the 2 of us would ever fully understand. "I'll go look right now," I said. That was enough. That has always been enough.